No, thank you. I really appreciate the invite. It's always great being back here. My son went to A&M Chemical Engineering, even though I went to UT. I had no control over that. We were here, I think, 2 weeks ago for the Notre Dame A&M football game, which, we'll just leave it at that. But anyway, it's really great being back here. As Strato said, I'm on the advisory board, and it's great hearing all the great work that's going on here. I mean, you folks are really, in my opinion, this is like kind of the tip of the spear where a lot of the creative and fundamental and significant research that needs to be done, frankly, to drive the energy transition. I mean, I kind of wish, we were joking at dinner last night, I wish I was in your seats right now, kind of. I'm not sure. But I mean, especially if you go into the energy industry, and maybe folks are thinking other things, but there is so much happening right now. I mean, this is one of the world's biggest energy transitions. This only happens once every 50, 100 years, just to put that into perspective. And, when you think about the scale of the energy industry, and I'll get into that in a minute, with hydrogen, this is where you all can make a very significant impact. When my kids were asking me, well, Dad, I want to design the next iPhone 20 or whatever it is. It's like, you can go do that. But I convinced my son in chemical engineering, you can make a huge impact to the planet for the work that you're all doing here for the energy system. So it's very, very significant and important. So great to be here. What I'd like to do is spend a little bit of time on this study that I was involved in. Many of you are probably not familiar with the National Petroleum Council. It was actually set up very quickly by President Harry Truman in the late 30s. And the reason he set up this council was because he recognized the importance of energy industry and winning the war. And so he set it up as in a kind of an advisory group to the executive branch. It then, in the late 70s, got transferred to the Department of Energy more formally. So that's how this works. Basically, the Department of Energy, in this case, Secretary Granholm, writes a letter. In this case, the chair of the National Petroleum Council is my boss, which is Darren Woods, who's the CEO for ExxonMobil, and writes a list of questions of importance for the energy system. We usually do these studies, say, once every year or two. And this one happened to be on hydrogen. Darren asked me to help lead it for ExxonMobil. And so I'm going to talk you through, usually, it's already 11:15. I'm going to blow through this. It takes about 25 minutes. I've also added a few charts of some specific things that ExxonMobil is doing in this space as well, that if we have time, I'd like to at least, get to that. I'm okay if you want to answer questions throughout the talk. At the end. Okay, that's fine. So I'll try to go through this in about 25-ish minutes, and then I've got like 3 charts at the end, and then we can wrap up, do whatever you want. Okay. Is there a controller? There we go. Okay, a little bit about probably focus on the top right, because that's the National Petroleum Council is actually about 200 people. Okay, and it's a broad. I wish we wouldn't call it the Petroleum Council because it's much broader than that. And that distribution shows you the distribution of a particular study. Was almost 300 participants, so it's a very broad-ranging study. And the secretary basically asked, how do you bring hydrogen to scale in the United States across the entire value chain? Very, very complicated study. It took us 2 years to nail this down. But I think it was it's been a pretty influential study. We got a lot of feedback from trades and NGOs, and obviously the ultimate customers, the DOE and the Biden administration. But just to show you the distribution of folks, I did one of these like 15 years ago. It was 90% oil and gas. But look at the distribution today. I mean, it just shows you how broad the energy system is. So it's manufacturing, distribution, management consulting, industrial gas providers, and nonprofits. So that was, to me, the most interesting thing. We had people from the Environmental Defense Fund, the Mitchell Institute, the Great Plains Institute. They don't have the same view that oil and gas does. We'll just start there. So it was a lot of discussion throughout this whole study to actually share their views, our views, and at the end of the day, I think it was a much more significant study because of their participation. So it was a fascinating study from my perspective. And you can see that if you're interested, and go online right now and download the study. Brace yourself, it's like 1,400 pages long. The executive summary, if you really want to just digest it, is only 60 pages. What I would say, though, you could probably read the first 25 and you'll get the gist of the report. Okay, key attributes for the study. First, and I've already heard some of the great techno-economic modeling that's going on here, but it really was informed by diversity of people that are actually building stuff, putting steel on the ground. We have real world economics. A lot of the economics you hear out there are not grounded in facts and tend to be way too optimistic. So that's a key part of, and that's why the government likes this National Petroleum Council, because we bring in that real world perspective. We talked about what is the role of LCI hydrogen, by the way, stands for low carbon intensity. We're trying to stay away from the color wheel that you probably heard. We lost that battle. I was thinking, University of Texas orange and maroon to A&M. I tried to do that for blue versus green. It didn't go anywhere, but I tried. But what is the role of low carbon intensity hydrogen? It doesn't fit everywhere. It has some specific uses. And then what I think was really unique about the study is that we didn't look at the US as a whole. We actually broke up the United States into 11 distinct regions. And this was a specific request by the Department of Energy and actually some of the folks on the NPC in particular. And what you'll see, not much of a surprise, is that the US Gulf Coast is going to be a major player in hydrogen. So that was a lot of good insight. I will tell you, when we delivered this report to Secretary Granholm at the end of April of this year, her response was, wow, this is sobering. And to me, that hit the mark, because what it said is, we've actually, and other people came up to me in the DOE and said, hey, this is really a clear-eyed view of what it's going to take, because people don't have an appreciation for how big this, the energy system is. A little bit about the modeling. As I mentioned, a lot of key inputs from DOE, NREL, National Labs, the folks on the NPC. We worked very closely with MIT, their energy initiative. They have some pretty unique tools in looking at techno-economics, as well as it's called an EPA model, which is a pretty sophisticated energy systems optimization model. And from that, we looked at two scenarios. One was called stated policies, which is essentially includes the IRA, okay, the Inflation Reduction Act that you're probably familiar with, and then a very aggressive US net zero by 2050. So think of those as the bookends, and that's what we modeled. And through all this sophisticated modeling, we were able to model what might be the growth of the supply of hydrogen, demand of hydrogen, how much green, blue, and then what regions, and then how much is the cost to society. So that was kind of the nature of the work. Okay, so first key set of data is that low carbon intensity hydrogen will play a key role, but what people I think are surprised of, it probably will only account for less than 10% of the total US emissions. And because the reason for that is it's not a silver bullet, but it goes after what we would call the very hard to decarbonize parts of our energy system. So for us, that's our refining and chem plants. Very hard to decarbonize, but we think there's a key role for hydrogen to play. Transportation, think of heavy duty transportation, those big 18-wheelers that are driving 500 miles versus batteries. Hydrogen could have a role, and potentially limited applications. But this shows you, so this is where we are today in the US. The net zero gets you down to obviously net zero by 2050. That's what we forced the model to do. The stated policy scenario only gets you about halfway there. And then this little gray wedge here shows you the emissions that are addressed specifically by low carbon intensity hydrogen. And that's where you get about this 8%. And I'll peel the onion back as to where that fits. We then looked at what is the cost to society, and that's the the chart on the figure on the right. And basically, if you focus on the net zero, it's about 3% of GDP. So you ask, well, what does that mean in real terms of dollars? So by 2050, most economists think our GDP will be around 38-ish trillion dollars. So 1% is over $1 trillion. So it's a pretty significant number, but it's within I would say, a reasonable band. 3% is something like what you spend on healthcare or the defense industry, that sort of thing. Then we asked the model to run the same scenario without low carbon intensity hydrogen, and that's the gray hashed on top. And what it told us was that if you don't have low carbon intensity hydrogen, actually the cost is going to be higher, anywhere from 0.5% to about 1%. So even though it only impacts 10% of the emissions, it kind of has almost a 30% impact on the overall cost. And that's because if you don't have low carbon intensity hydrogen to use in these hard to decarbonize sectors, the model starts looking for other backstops, which is generally direct air capture, which tends to be higher cost. So it has to replace what I would call a lower cost fix for a higher cost option like direct air capture. Okay, does that generally make sense? Okay. And this is another way of showing it. We looked at kind of the implied, what is the implied cost of carbon? Again, the stated policy scenario is fairly low, kind of less than 100. But basically the backstop is direct air capture, because the model is looking for, how to ensure that last ton of carbon is taken out of the atmosphere. And that's why you see this significant increase up to, roughly $600 to $700 a ton, because the model is starting to pull more and more on things like that. But another important number is to look at the average cost, which is around 250. So think of this as the last drop of CO2 you need to take out. But in general, the overall average cost is more around 225. So it gives you a feel for, wow, that last amount of carbon or CO2 is going to be hard and probably expensive. So it kind of, again, I would just view these as ranges, view them as bookends, but that kind of gave us a good view of how this might develop over time. Okay, so I'm gonna show you a supply demand for hydrogen, and then I'll show you the regionality, and then we'll talk a little bit about costs at the end. Okay, so from a demand perspective, the model allowed us to look at 4 key demand sectors, which are primarily industry, power gen, transportation, and we also, even though this was a US focused study, the Department of Energy and actually folks in the executive branch were very interested in the ability to convert hydrogen into ammonia and then ship ammonia to places like Asia Pacific, like Japan, Korea, the EU, where they don't have very good options. Japan, for example, does not have very good decarbonization options. They're looking at ammonia, believe it or not, making ammonia here in the US Gulf Coast, putting it on a ship and blending that in with their coal-fired power facilities as a way to reduce emissions. So it turned out exports was a pretty big number in this analysis. So that's the top end. So here are the 2 scenarios, stated policies, net zero. Right now, we make about 11 million metric tons of hydrogen, primarily taken by industries like ours. Most of our refining chem plants there's always a hydrogen plant right next door, because we're always upgrading we're using hydrogen to upgrade refinery fuels to make, ultra low sulfur fuels, that sort of thing. But basically, you can see kind of essentially a doubling of demand in the stated policies, again, with this IRA support. To get to net zero, though, it's about a 7-fold increase. So it goes from about 11 to 75 million metric tons. That's a pretty significant increase. But you can see by the colors that industry by far dominates the demand. So the industry here is basically 2 tranches. One is kind of the ongoing use of upgrading refinery fuels, making methanol, making ammonia. That's kind of what we do today. The other significant tranche is basically for industrial heat. So that's basically backing out natural gas and replacing it with low carbon intensity hydrogen. Because when you burn hydrogen, as you know, no CO2 emissions are involved. So that is kind of the, that's what's in that industry wedge. Starting from the top, I talked about exports, transportation. This is typically heavy duty transportation for trucking. Power gen, as the grid becomes net zero, hydrogen has been used as a way of kind of stabilizing the grid as a source of energy, even for storage. And then a little bit of rescom means using hydrogen to heat, buildings like this. My personal opinion, you should just electrify that. It doesn't really make sense for hydrogen, but the model did pick up a little bit of that. Some of that is due to blending hydrogen into the natural gas pipeline network, but it's relatively small. Okay, so that's the demand, and then the supply looks like this. Can we maybe get to his question in a minute? On the supply side, basically what we looked at were two leading technologies. One is the electrolytic conversion of hydrogen. That's what's been called green. And then the other is blue hydrogen, which is the conversion of natural gas by steam methane reforming with carbon capture and storage. Okay, so those are the two kind of leading. There's other stuff out there like methane pyrolysis that we talked about. We didn't have the ability in the modeling to really have really good economics around some of these emerging technologies. So if I think you're familiar with the TRL level that DOE uses, we basically said we got to draw a line somewhere. We talk about it in the report, all these emerging technologies, but we kind of drew a line, I think around TRL 7 and above, just so we had some solid economics. But anyway, what you can see is in the stated policy scenario, blue kind of dominates, and then green comes on in the later years, both for stated and net zero. Green really starts to grow, or electrolytic conversion, in the net zero, because the model is looking for basically zero emissions. And we assumed in this case, it was a simplification that we had behind the meter power, fully renewable power 24/7. That's a big assumption because we know what the grid is today. But it basically, the model really starts to pull in a lot more green than blue. There were a lot of debates about this, particularly from NGOs about, there was a view that should be all green, no blue, but I think they finally came around to that if you really want to get after this, natural gas-based systems, particularly the system that we have in the US Gulf Coast, is the cheaper option than electrolytic conversion. And so it's the most rapid way to scale up this low carbon intensity hydrogen. So basically the message here, there's no silver bullet here. It's basically we need all technology options. So it really is a blend of blue and green is in my view and I think most of us felt the same way, is the likely solution here. But I will, and this is where we got this sobering comment. If you look at the cumulative investment, this is just the investment for the production side. And basically, it's probably hard to see in the back, but that the total cost for this to get to net zero just for hydrogen production is around $1.9 trillion. That's a cumulative investment. But what's important to note is that the hashed line refers to the green or electrolytic conversion. The solid black line is for natural gas-based processes. So the message here is that about 85–90% of the cost is really due to the electrolytic conversion. So that just tells you that the relative cost, and we just kind of wanted to position that. But that's why you see blue growing first, then followed by green. Okay, a little bit about the regionality. So as I mentioned, the model allowed us to divide it up into 11 different regions, and we thought there was a lot of thought that went into how to divvy up the United States. But I think what's probably jumping out at you is that the Gulf Coast, which in this case is a combination of Texas and Louisiana, are really dominating the use of hydrogen, and that's because, and I'll show you this in our Exxon charts, all along this Gulf Coast, from south of Houston Baton Rouge and in New Orleans, that's about 75-ish, 80% of the total emissions are all along that sector. That's where all the heavy industry is. So that's why the model is picking up a lot of the hydrogen, particularly for industrial heat, as well as we didn't really model this precisely, but as well as a pretty significant amount for export. So a lot of cheap gas here, low cost cheap gas, differentiated natural gas, we believe, because we can get the carbon intensity of the natural gas down pretty low. And that will serve as an export to countries like Asia Pacific and Europe. The interesting thing was on the west side, or sorry, the west region, where the policies here are things like the California's low carbon fuel standard for transportation. That's why you see a bigger wedge for transportation as opposed to other parts in the United States. So when we showed this data, I think you're familiar with the hydrogen hubs, that the DOE awarded, and they awarded them all over the United States. And the question we got was, well, gosh, that doesn't match up with the hubs that we just awarded, except for, there's a hub in the Gulf Coast, as you all know. There's one in California. There's one in the kind of Great Lakes region. But, there's some up in the Northwest and the Northeast. And it really came down to, what are the relative competitive advantages for each of these regions? So in the Gulf Coast, you have an abundance of low-cost natural gas. You've got very good renewable resources like solar and wind. You've got all this access to infrastructure, and I'll highlight that in a minute, and a potential to anchor the demand. The way I see this playing out is that you're going to have these large industrial facilities that are using low carbon intensity hydrogen to decarbonize our facilities. And then that would serve as an anchor for transportation or power, because you've kind of de-risked that whole system. So I think that's really what this means. It's an anchor demand for these other sectors. On the West, this is where a lot of the mobility action is happening, with the low carbon fuel centers and low carbon fuel standard, and this act is the Advanced Clean Trucking Rule, I think is what that stands for. And then the Great Lakes, again, you've got a lot of in the region of the central US, you've got very good high wind capacity for renewables. So it picked up, actually, I don't have the chart in here, but if you look at the supply chart, the green electrolytic hydrogen is actually pretty big here in the Great Lakes. The way, and we talk about this in the report, the way I see this happening is that you can almost draw a triangle between Great Lakes, Gulf Coast, and the West. And you could imagine that the hubs are starting here in these three regions, but then they actually might get connected up. So that's kind of how we talk about this in the narrative of the report. When you think about when we address the question of the DOE, how might this thing evolve over time? Okay. All right, now a little bit about the costs, and this is a little bit more on the sobering view. So I'll maybe just focus on the left-hand side. So this is the levelized cost of hydrogen, delivered hydrogen costs as a function of different applications. And this is a 2050 view. And so what the report says is that the cost for natural gas-based hydrogen with CCS is around $2, maybe $3.50 for electrolytic. But if you want to replace that for the incumbent, the low carbon the high carbon intensity incumbent, like a refinery feedstock, you can see you're pretty close. You're almost in the money here. And by the way, this is with no IRA support. This is no policy. But you can see when you're trying to replace hydrogen, all the work you've done to make a low carbon intensity hydrogen and replace that with unabated natural gas, that shows you that there's still a gap here. And so one of the big recommendations to the Department of Energy is, hey, the IRA has been helpful on the supply side, but we have a gap here on the demand side, and so we need more policy to bridge that gap. Otherwise, it's what I've sometimes said is the IRA is a bridge to nowhere unless you have a demand that's going to take the hydrogen that you're producing. And it's the same kind of story on the heavy duty transportation side. Okay, so there's a lot of words on here. We came out with 23 recommendations. I won't go, I'll just maybe touch on one or two of these. We broke them into policy and regulation just for ease. We had a big focus on the societal considerations and impacts. The Biden administration is very focused on what they call Justice 40, which basically says for disadvantaged communities, about 40% of any value that comes out of these, these low carbon facilities has to go to to disadvantaged communities. So we actually spent quite a bit of time, and we have a whole chapter devoted just to that topic. And basically what it says is, and I've worked at our Baytown facility for 7 years, is you have to be a good neighbor to the fence line communities that live and exist around those large facilities. And we need to do a better job, frankly, of talking about why it's it helps the local community. They're very good jobs, but we want to make sure that we're reducing emissions, reducing the noise. It's all types of stuff that go around these big facilities, and we need to talk about that and how the energy transition can help those communities. So what it means is we got to get much better at communicating with the communities about what this. A lot of folks don't understand what CCS is. They have no idea what hydrogen means. So we need to do a better job of talking about it. So we spent a lot of time in the report talking about this. In fact, it was some of the bulk of the recommendations here. On the policy regulation side, probably the two ones that are getting the most interest is coming up with a national low carbon intensity industry or transportation standard. So what do I mean by that? So think about what's going on in the LCFS in California, where they basically have agreed on a carbon intensity reduction line over time. There's some issues with it. It's not full well to wheels, and it tends to focus on battery electrics. But think about bringing that from a state level to a national level, where you can agree on a carbon intensity reduction over time that's tech neutral, market driven, it's transparent. That's what we were recommending that would help drive this hydrogen economy, both for industry and for transportation, because those are the two big users. So there's a lot of talk right now about how to actually do that. There's not a lot of interest in a general price on carbon, because we've been talking about that for 15, 20 years. People view that as a tax. So maybe this is a one way to get there that's more specific for the demand side. On the technology side, you can see there's a lot of work around, reducing the cost gap. And we have a whole chapter of what to do around hydrogen fuel cells and hydrogen production and that sort of thing. And then I will maybe touch on item 20, which was, and this is something that EDF in particular was very interested in. We got to make sure that when we're building this new network, this new value chain, that we reduce the emissions, because hydrogen emissions is an indirect greenhouse gas, and we got to make sure that we don't have hydrogen, especially in the more distributed markets. I would say in the transportation, we don't want to have. Obviously, there's a safety issue, but we want to make sure that that we don't undo all the good with releasing hydrogen in the atmosphere. It's the same kind of the story around the methane emissions. You got to minimize the methane emissions to essentially nil. I'll just stop there. Yeah. And happy to take any questions that you might have.
Excellent. Thank you very much.